Fantastic. So please, round of applause for Jess. Hello, Jess.
Hello, Dominic.
You sound
Very fantastic to
fantastic.
be here.
Look, yeah, your
You're
microphone,
fantastic.
it's amazing.
Oh, your microphone sounds amazing. Stop it, you.
So Jess was the person who told me to get this microphone because my sound was awful.
And now it's fantastic. It's a happy ending.
It is. What are your plans over the holidays?
Oh, looking after two toddlers and a baby. That's hashtag parent life.
It sounds like a lot of work. Any
Yeah.
non-work that is planned?
No, that's it. Just it'll be 100% full time times three.
Woo! That's a lot of percent. That's all the percent. Jess, you're going to talk about GraphQL for designers. I'm really excited about it because that's one of the technologies that we use a lot, and I'm really keen for designers to at least know what that means.
Yeah, it should be great. Hopefully, there's some designers in the room that will get some of that out of this, and also some developers as well that will get something out of it too.
Um, Totes me goats, as they say. I'm going to give you the screen, and I'm going to shut up, and then it's all yours. Thank you, Jess.
All right. Thank you, Dominic. Right. Hello, everybody. I am going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. All right. Dominic, jump in if I have messed up my sharing at all, but I think this is visible to everyone. So, welcome to our talk, GraphQL for designers and gap analysis. I'll get into gap analysis in the second half of the talk, so let's park that for now. To start with, I want to talk about GraphQL. Now, this is going to be a kind of very basic intro into what is GraphQL and why you should care about it when working with developers. It's not something that I would expect designers to be using day to day, but it's a technology that developers are using. Like Dominic mentioned, that it's something we're using every day. A lot of companies around the world are starting to pick it up. It's still in its infancy. There are a lot of companies around the world that are not using GraphQL yet, but there's growing interest every day. So it's definitely about time that everyone kind of has an understanding, and hopefully I can give you some of that understanding today. So GraphQL, what is GraphQL? Let's start there. GraphQL is a application programming interface. You might have heard it by its acronym API. So GraphQL is an API. It's a way of interfacing with computers. It's a way of getting data. GraphQL, it's actually is it a portmanteau? I'm not sure exactly how to say what it is, but graph is one part. QL stands for query language. So it's a graph query language. The idea being that you want to query for some data. It can also update data as well. So it's just a thing, but it can also modify that data. But to understand GraphQL, it's important that we understand what is an API. And I want to start with what most people think of when they say an API. Most people think of APIs as REST APIs, REST, REST APIs. Now, this is a somewhat generic term, at least much more generic than what GraphQL is. It does have a definition, but I think it has multiple definitions depending on who you talk to. And it ultimately boils down to the ability to query data and also update data, the same as GraphQL, but without any enforcing of the structure of the data that's returned. So it's very open ended, which is good. It gives it a lot of power. And to give an example, if I switch to my browser here, this one, so we can see here that this is a bunch of data on the screen. This is pretty unusable for a human. It's not meant to be usable for a human. This is meant to be usable by a computer. Now, this is the response. This is the data returned by the API. Now, an API is an application programming interface. Now, interface is the key word at the end there, where you're probably familiar with user interfaces, where there's some way that the user is interacting with a computer. That's the user interface. Now, an API is a way that an application is interacting with another computer. Now, how does a user interact with a user interface? Well, usually there's some UI, there's buttons, like you can see a couple of buttons and drop downs up here. So that's part of the UI. What's the application programming interface? It's usually this in the URL. In fact, this is often referred to more correctly as a URI, a uniform resource indicator, I believe, often confused with the URL, universal resource location, but used interchangeably, which is fine. The interesting part here is that there's this website, the spacedevs.com, and they've set up an API. It's at version 2.1.0. And the way that you interface with this API is through this /launch/upcoming. So this is the equivalent of a button in a UI or something along those lines. It has a very defined task and it has a very defined result. And so when you make a request to this, you get some data back. Now, this data, like I said, is pretty useless for a human. It's not meant to be read by a human, but we can make it look a bit better. The format of this data is something called JSON. And you can see that in the URL here as well, format JSON. The last bit there, mode list, that's just a quirk of this API. It's not that common. Now, this is a very specific font. You can see quotes around this text. This one doesn't have quotes because it's a number. You can see open brackets here, open curly braces here. Now, this is a very specific format called JSON. It's the JavaScript object notation. And a computer is able to understand this because it's specific. Now, whereas a computer has a hard time understanding a UI because that's a user interface, it's very good at understanding an API. And this is how computers communicate between each other. Now, REST is just one form of API. There's a bunch of others. There's JSON RPC. There's a whole bunch of other ones that are used in various applications. GraphQL is another form of an API. In this particular case, this API is returning some upcoming rocket launches. I'm sure we all saw the spectacular SpaceX success/failure of a launch the other day. If you haven't, go check it out. I won't spoil the ending, but it was quite awesome. So we're going to look at what's coming up next to see if there's anything else interesting. And so we've loaded up this API, and from this we can get some data. We can see the Falcon Sirius XM7 is launching, or rather, it was launched. There you go. Maybe that's happened in the last few minutes. So these kinds of things. So this is an example of data that can be returned by an API. GraphQL. So what makes GraphQL interesting over this kind of data? Well, this kind of data is what you call flat. It doesn't allow you to query through to related data. So if we look at this really quickly, we can see that we already looked at the name here. So we can see that it's a Falcon Sirius XM7. That's great. And then we can see there's some extra information down here, the locations at Cape Canaveral, et cetera, et cetera. There's images, right? But that's the only information. There's nothing else in here. So one thing I might be interested in is who is it that's launching this rocket, and what is their headquarters location? Okay, so we got LSP name here. It's SpaceX. Okay, that makes sense. Now, where are they located in the world? It's not in this result returned from this API. Okay, that's fine. What we can do is maybe use this information to go and look up SpaceX in some other API. Maybe it's the space.com/agency or something along those lines. That's fine. We can do that, and that works. But when you start thinking about the user experience side of these queries out to an API, is the API has to respond once with some data, and then the application has to make a second request and has to respond again. And if there's any more, it has to make a third request and so on. And those requests add up over time. 1 second, I've just had a slight technical difficulty with my audio. Forgive me for just a moment.
You sound great, Jess, apart from that little vibration in the background.
All right. Thank you, Dominic. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear anything. My headphones had a connection problem because it was connected to my phone and my phone took over. But we're back. Okay, so we can make multiple requests, and that's fine. But the user experience starts to suffer. There's extra loading time required for each request that goes out to these APIs. I mean, it's manageable. For example, this API has found 183 launches, and it's returned all of that data here. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different launches in this list. Well, what you can do with some APIs is you can limit that down so that there's, say, only 2 results returned, because the use case we have, we only want to show 2. So if we load that URL and then we get throttled by the API, that's fine. We already saw the example there. What we can do then is limit that so that it only shows 2 results. That speeds up the API request. We still have the problem, though, that if in the future we want to request more data, that means more API calls and more faffing around with trying to figure out how do we piece all this data together. And when you get down to it and you really think through the data, it starts to make sense that data is shaped more like a graph. So if I show you this kind of picture here, you can see on the left here, so we've got a REST API, a traditional REST API, where everything's just one big blob of data. On the GraphQL side, it changes the way you think about your data. It's more related data than it is one big blob. So you might have some data that is a rocket, and that rocket has a related agency, for example, SpaceX. SpaceX then has some, maybe you can query the business number of the company or their headquarters, for example. That agency also has a history of past launches, and each launch is also associated with a rocket and a launch pad. And those rockets, of course, each have an agency, and they have fuel, and maybe they have materials, other information related to them. So you can see how this is more of a graph than it is a big chunk of data. And this more accurately represents this GraphQL layout more accurately represents how the data actually exists. Often it better represents how the data is stored in the databases, but also how humans, think about that data. And after all, these applications are for users at the end of the day. So it's good to have that kind of that modeling. So that's how GraphQL differs from your traditional APIs. I should mention that JSON that we saw, the return response from the REST API, is also the response that you get from a GraphQL API. And so here's the same API, but this time it's a GraphQL API. It has a similar query that you can do for the upcoming launches. So again, we can see in the REST API, it was launch/upcoming. And here it's launch _upcoming list. It has some results, and then you can get some data out. So let's see if this query works. Unfortunately, we've been rate limited there, but that's fine because you would have seen the same amount of data coming back anyway. And it comes back in the same format in JSON. So that is a GraphQL request. Is you on this side, you define which query you want to make. So again, in our REST API example, we define the query here. And then you can even go further by also defining, say, the limit, the number of things you want to query for. And then you can take it a step further and search for the name contains Falcon, for example. We only want to look up the upcoming launch for the SpaceX Falcon rocket. That's pretty cool. Then GraphQL takes it one step even further and it says, hey, look, you probably don't want that huge dump of data that we're looking at before. What you probably want is just a couple of pieces of that data. And the pieces that I want is name, an image, the launch service providers, the agency, so SpaceX, for example. Net is when it launches, the latitude and longitude of the launch pad. And that makes sense, right? It's I, as the developer or the designer, define the data requirements, and I want to be able to say, I only need these bits of data. No need to fetch that huge JSON blob, which can oftentimes be up to megabytes, even tens of megabytes, depending on the API of data. And you don't want to have to fetch all of it, let's say, on a user's mobile. It'd slow down their phone. It'd take ages to load. It'd chew through all their bandwidth. It's not worth it. So what we can do is define exactly the data we want to get back. GraphQL will then go away. It'll collate all that data and it'll return it for us in a nice JSON object. So that's fantastic. So that's what GraphQL. That's the power of GraphQL. It also allows us to start doing things like the graph-based queries. So there's the rocket, then an agency, and then it has other information. And so you can see that happen here. So there's the launches, and there's provider the agency, and that has related information. Name. You could go further, and that could also have, say, tax, and in that is like business number, and headquarters could be also have a location field. And so you can see how you start drilling down into the graph, but none of this information will actually be returned unless we requested it. And so that's the power of GraphQL. And this is the reason why developers are falling in love with GraphQL, is because it has that impact on the user experience at the end of the day. We can do faster queries for more related, richer data without impacting the user's experience, which is fantastic. And I hope we all agree that that's a big win. So that's the API. So let's jump into a kind of a real world example. I'm calling the launch tracker. So if I jump over to Figma, and you can check out my my awesome design skills once I open the correct Figma file here. And I'm going to tell you the truth, a little secret while it's loading, is I didn't actually design this. This is a Tailwind template that I just kind of put some pieces together. But hey, it looks great. So imagine this is a design that we've come up with, and we want to show the upcoming launches that we were just looking at, but we want to show them in a nice little grid here with an image. So you can see some interesting information about this card here. There's an image for starters. There's this watch icon in the corner here. There's the agency that's doing the launch. There's the date of the launch, pretty important information. The title, some location information. So it's pretty cool. We got like the basics of stuff that we want in each of these cards. Maybe clicking through to one of these takes you to some more details. All right, so that's fine. So in the traditional way of working is design would work on this. They'd make it pixel perfect. It looks great. Product signs off on this, and they hand it over to developers to go and implement. Now the developers might go, okay, great. We can sit down and we can work on this. Let's go and grab the image. Easy. We got an image. Let's pop it in there. Let's go and get the launch date. Easy. We got that. Let's go and grab the logos of the agencies. Oh, we don't have the logos of the agencies. What should we do here? I don't know. Let's just park that ticket. We'll come back to it later. Put on the backlog. We'll get back to it. We've got a deadline. We need to launch this in 2 weeks. Okay. We got the name. We got the location. Actually, we don't have the location. We have the latitude and longitude, but we don't actually have the location string like in the designs here. Okay, let's just park that as well. We got what we got. Let's go and show the product team, hey, they're all happy with it. Let's plug on. Actually, hey, product team, we're kind of running behind schedule here. We didn't realize that we didn't have some of this data available. It's going to take us, probably an extra month to get this data because of reasons. What should we do? And then, everyone's pulling their hair out. It's like, oh, it's had a 2-week deadline. It's already been in development for a week and a half. We promised the CEO we'd launch this. We've spoken to shareholders. What are we going to do? Oh my God. And, everyone has a meltdown. So that's not a great process to go through. Now, GraphQL, I'm not going to lie, is not going to save you here. It's not going to help you out with that problem, but it is going to make it easier to discover which data you have available. So if we jump back to this GraphQL query here, each one of these items that I can ask for, I can also have it suggest to me. So if I do a key combo here, I can see all of the possible items that are available. Now, this is really nice. This comes baked into GraphQL because of the way that you define as a developer. You define exactly what data is available and how that data relates to other data. So we want the name. Oh, look, there it is, name. We can also do some, it does partial. So you can see as I'm typing, name, name. Great. And so that makes it much easier for us as developers to discover, hey, this bit of data is actually available. Now, similarly for launch service provider, this is our agency like SpaceX. We might get their name, and we might also go, okay, we want their headquarters. Okay, so let's see if headquarters is available. No, maybe HQ. No, it's not there. Location. No, it's not there. Okay, so I can't seem to find any information about what's available for the provider. Now, this is a good point where I could dive into the documentation a bit more. So I could dive into this info, which comes for free with GraphQL, and figure out what exactly is available. And maybe I find that it's not available, and I'm able to flag that early in the process instead of right at the end. Now, this act of flagging it early in the process, in my experience, that's probably been the biggest change in the way that I work, with the biggest impact in recent years. And that's because I've performed a process that I've been calling a gap analysis. If I can get the slide up, gap analysis. Now, this gap analysis is, the idea is we look at a set of designs, like in our Figma file here, and then we look at a set of data that's available, and we find where the gaps are. The process that I've followed, which I found to be very successful in every team that I've used this with, is to sit down as early as possible, probably even earlier than what these designs look now, when it might even just be a sketch on a piece of paper, a sketch in Sketch.app, whatever. It might be really early on in the designs, and you get together the designer and the developer, and you say, hey, look, I'm thinking of putting this bit of information here. Is this information available? Let's find the gap. Now, it's really important that at this stage, when you're trying to define these gaps, that the developer is sitting down, looking at the GraphQL API, and the designer is sitting down, looking at the design in the same room, or in the same room virtually via Zoom. And you are going through top to bottom at the same time and getting answers and writing those answers down on the spot. Now, I have tried this without doing it on the spot and kind of doing it as an asynchronous thing and sending emails or Slack messages or tickets in Jira, and it just doesn't work as well. It tends to get forgotten. It tends to end up being a much longer process than it really needs to be. Now, don't get me wrong, this can be a long process, and you'll understand in just a second why. But what I've found is that if you bite the bullet and spend the time early, you can save yourself weeks or even months of work down the track and a lot of heartache. You can avoid all of those broken promises. You can avoid those missed deadlines. Well, some of them anyway. And you can get more stuff done that everybody is on board with, everyone's happy with. So as an example, let's do a gap analysis on this design here. So we might start at the top and we go, okay, what can we see? We can see an image here. What can we get from the API? Well, we know already that we can get an image. Let's see if this will return now. No, it's another 587 seconds. So we can get an image here. That's great. That's exactly what we wanted. So there's no gap there. That works fine. We can get, say, the launch date here. Okay, let's go and have a look in our API. Yep, we can get net, and net I know is the launch date. It doesn't quite look the same as what the data is displayed in the design. So here it's December 2nd, comma, 01 and 33 UTC. The actual data that comes back is more like, 12 to 79173 colon 23, etc. It's a computer generated date, but I know as a developer that I can convert that into a human readable date. So it doesn't really count as a gap because the data is there. It's just in a different format. I just need to work with that a bit, and that's fine. Things like the title. Can we get the title? We can by looking at this. We know there's the name of the upcoming launch. Then we start getting into things like the logo here. Okay, so if I look at the API, I can see there's the service provider. Let's see if there's an image. Oh, great. There's an image URL. Now, if I ran that query, unfortunately it won't work, but if I ran that query, I would see that in the results, that returns null. It returns empty for every single provider. It doesn't matter who they are. It's always coming back null. Now, me as a developer, I'm sitting in the room going, that's weird because, when I looked at this last week, I saw image URL is there, but I never actually tested it. I didn't think to. I just thought, oh, yeah, the data's there. Of course it is. But no, it's coming back null. Every single time I query it for SpaceX, for NASA, it doesn't matter who. Now, the designer in the room is saying, well, thank you for catching that. What can we do instead? It's like, well, I don't know. Look, we have the name. Maybe we could use that instead. And so the designer says, that is fine. Don't worry about having the logo. What we can do instead is we can just pop the name in. Great, done. That gap has been checked off and moved on in 30 seconds or less. But if we hadn't been sitting in the room together, the developer would have looked at this and said, yep, there is a yes, there is a logo here that we can, let me put that back on. Yes, there is a logo here that we can get because I can see it in the API. It's right here. It's called image URL. Fine, I can do that. It'll take me 30 seconds. Here's the Jira ticket. Meanwhile, they pick up that ticket, and after half an hour of debugging, why everything comes back, no, like what's going on? Oh, there's a random comment in here that says, talk to Sue in legal about these images. Talk to Sue in legal. What? Okay, I'll send off an email. You get a response a day later. It turns out that we're not allowed to use those images for legal reasons because we don't have the copyright to them. Well, we don't have the copyright to them. Okay, right. Send another email to Sue. Like, how can we get this? What's the process? Well, Sue says, there was a process started to get these images. We can kick that back off again if you like. You need this for this project? Yes, I need this for this project. All right, let's start that process. It'll take about a month to get them all approved. A month? Damn, that's pushed our budget by a whole month. And by this time, a week of email back and forth has gone past. Now, that week of emails before you find out that it's going to be another month versus the 30 seconds of why don't we just change it to the name, that's the power of the gap analysis. That's why it's really useful to be able to sit down in the room and make decisions on the spot. And you found that you can find out that information much easier by sitting it out on the API, running the query, actually getting a response, unlike the error that I'm getting here, and be able to make those calls straight away. So if we continue off the gap analysis, maybe we get down to the location here. And like I mentioned before, we've got a lat long, a latitude and a longitude, but we don't have an actual address. Okay, all right. So we do know that we already have access to, say, the Google Maps API, and we can query out to that with the latitude and longitude to give us a response back. But that's going to take another 2 days to set up, and there's costs associated with that. So we have to get it signed off by finance and all these kinds of things. Well, the designer says, look, I don't really care about the actual address here. And the developers perks up, oh, really? I thought you did. It was in the designs. No, I just put that in because people want to know roughly where it is. Oh, the developer remembers that back in the API, it actually has another field, which is the name. And that name is a human readable name, such as Houston, right? And that would fit perfectly in this design, such as SpaceX South Texas launch site. That fits perfectly fine in this space. It does not need to be an actual address. Great. We just spent another 30 seconds to save ourselves another week of development effort. Perfect, right? Maybe this little eye icon up here. What's this doing up here? Oh, this is to watch the launch. Oh, to watch the launch. Okay, got it. Okay, that's fine. I can do that. We can make that a link out to the YouTube live feed of the launch. No. I meant to watch notifications of when the launch might occur, or if there's any delays, or if it gets cancelled. Oh, okay, that's different. Meanwhile, this conversation's happening async over the course of a few days. The PM is talking to the designer, who's talking to the developers. Finally, you get to consensus of what this actually means, and the developer comes back and says, notifications. Yeah, we've got notification system. We can hook into our existing notification system, sending out emails and SMS. We just need to get approval for budget because it costs a lot of money to send those SMS. We need to go and talk to legal because we need to capture the user's phone number at some point. So we need to show the cookie warning, and all these kinds of things start popping up. And the designer's like, whoa, no. This was meant to be useful for the user, not make it really annoying, like pop-ups and asking for their phone number and stuff. Let's just take that off. I just put that on because I thought it would be a nice feature. Oh, great. So if we had had that conversation during the gap analysis early on, it would have taken 30 seconds. It's gone. No problem. Look, we've simplified down our design a whole bunch. Now we can launch this in the 2-week window. And that's roughly the process of doing gap analysis. And aided by the fact that you have a GraphQL API where you can easily request just the data that you need that is also related. So one thing that you could do on here is if you did have the logos for the SpaceX and Ariane space here, maybe you also had some other information like their location, and hovering over the logo would show a pop-up of their location. That's powered by the graph in GraphQL. So it might be a location, this old gem of address 1, address 2, postcode, etc. Right? So maybe that's how you query the graph to get that data, and so on and so forth. And so that is GraphQL for designers with gap analysis. Thank you very much.
Woo! Thank you very much, Jess. If you want to stop sharing your screen, we can see your face bigger. Woohoo! There he is.
Alrighty. Hello.
That was fantastic. That was actually a really great visual walkthrough. What we should do more often and have to do in design system space anyway. We have to work with designers and developers all together, and how much faster you get to results because of it. I absolutely love that.
Yeah. It really is software developers and designers really coming together. It's that whole code heart design it's really important that we get that right, I think.
That was just off the frame, but we'll believe that that's there. Jess, I've got only a few questions because you did a too good of a job to explain it all.
Wonderful. Love to hear it.
The first question is, what is the most common misconception people had about GraphQL that you've encountered over the years of you using it?
The years of experience that I have. I've got at least 15 years of experience in GraphQL that was released 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So most common misconception. So I guess the biggest problem that I've seen is from the developer side, and that comes from people who are much more familiar with old REST APIs. Sorry, I shouldn't say old, with REST APIs, and the way that they fetch and return data. And so I said at the top, REST APIs return kind of just one big dump of data. There's no real rhyme or reason to the shape of that data or to what data does and doesn't get included in that. I gave the example of getting the tax info for the agency. In that original query that I showed you, that info was not included. Why? Is that because the developer thought, oh, it's not used anywhere, so why include it? But what about future use cases? Is it because the product manager said, hey, we need to remove this because it's slowing down the page load? Who knows? And so those people with those preconceptions go into GraphQL and start applying that same logic to their GraphQL, what's called the schema, the shape of that data. Unfortunately, that when you apply that to GraphQL, it ends up, you lose a lot of the power of that graph that I showed before, where you can query into different data, especially that example at the end there of the location and the address 1, address 2, etc. And me as the front end developer, if I put my front end developer hat on, I only want that data under certain circumstances, so I don't want to have to burden the user's browser or whatnot with loading that data every single time. And if the data isn't available on a GraphQL API because the original developer set it up more like a REST API where they didn't include it, it makes it harder for me as the front-end developer. I've got to go back to that old way of doing multiple requests to get that data again. And so that's probably the biggest misconception, is that you can make it work like REST did without understanding the power and benefit you get of these new GraphQL idioms.
Yeah, there's a mind shift that you have to get to before you can really use the power and not abuse it. Another question, which I think is a bloody fantastic question, and maybe an idea for a product where we can all make millions and millions of dollars. Do you think we can pump that data right into Figma or any other design tool? Basically have like a little plugin that gives you the schema and shows you like the documentation of that data that you're displaying there, and it flashes red if it doesn't exist, and you're like, ooh, yeah.
Yes, definitely. And there are such things that already exist. It's a great question though, because it does highlight one of the powers of GraphQL in that it's much more structured and rigid in the way that you must define your API. Whereas REST, like I said, there's a few different definitions. There's no real rigid way of defining it. There's some great tools out there to help with REST. One of them is Swagger, you might have heard of. It's particularly good for documentation. The only the problem is that it doesn't enforce anything along the lines of consistency and documenting everything, unless you're very rigorous in your development practice. With GraphQL, it simply won't work unless you define it in a way that can easily be documented. That documentation can also be read by a computer, and so that computer, using an API, which is, it's a bit meta because it's an API for the API, can fetch information about that API, such as, the launch pad name, and then a Figma plugin, for example, could query out to that API for the API, understand that there are these bits of data, and then piece together a UI that has that kind of nested data shown. Like, those kinds of things are definitely possible, and there are already tools that do that, which are really fantastic. And it's a testament to how far we've come in thinking about how data is exchanged between programs and how it influences the design as well. So I saw a really great demo a while back of I think it was Airbnb. They did some machine learning, which you were able to hand draw on a piece of paper a UI layout and take a photo, and it would consume that photo and convert it into design system components. Now imagine doing that, but then also it recognizing that this thing is a title, and we need to look for, say, the name or the title field in the GraphQL API and populate the data from there. So that is possible. There's no reason why it couldn't do that. Obviously, with all these kinds of auto-generated things, it didn't need tweaking. But if that gets you 90% of the way there, then why not? And those kinds of tools are our next generation, I guess, starting to be our current generation of tools that people are going to have to get familiar with.
And as we famously say in the developer world, the first 90% are really hard, and then the next 90% are much harder. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I really like this idea of making the GraphQL endpoint accessible to designers. So for them to even just look through what does exist, what do I have to work with? I really like that idea. It doesn't have to be automated. It doesn't have just an easy way of making it accessible for people. That's it. We've fresh ran out of questions.
Fantastic. Well, look, if anyone has any further questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at Jess Telford. Send me a DM, because this is the whole gap analysis process is something that I've been working on and tweaking through the last few clients that I've worked with, and been finding that it's had really great improvements and positive impacts in the way those teams work together. It is predicated on the availability of a GraphQL API. But it could work with other APIs, just not as well. I think it's just a little bit more tricky to understand what data is and isn't available. So if you've got any questions and you're wondering how you could do it yourself, please feel free to hit me up.
Perfect. Thank you, Jess. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dominic.